Welcome to the Heal Your Hunger Show, where we get to the heart of why you overeat and how to stop. If you struggle with food and weight like I did, welcome home. Okay, welcome to the Heal Your Hunger Show. So glad that you've joined me here today, and I have a great guest for you. You're just going to love every bit of this show, so fasten your seatbelts. I have here, well, let me just tell you, I went to a movie premiere the other night, and I was blown away by this movie that I saw. And it was just so touching. It was so wonderful about the Dalai Lama. The Last Dalai Lama is what the movie is titled. And afterwards, we had the extreme privilege of being introduced and being able to ask questions to the producer and the director of this wonderful movie. And then he agreed to be interviewed for this so that we could help get the word out about this movie. And so here we are. You're going to get really a taste of his life and what he's been doing to just increase compassion and consciousness around the world. So producer and director Lemle has been making feature films, television series, and documentary specials with spiritual, environmental, and socially conscious themes since 1971. What he's been doing, one of the most notable things is in 1992, Lemle produced and directed the multi-award-winning documentary Compassion in Exile, the story of the 14th Dalai Lama. And for this film, the Dalai Lama personally granted unprecedented access and cooperation. And the film, the first major movie that was made about His Holiness, introduced millions of people all over the world to the Dalai Lama. And actually, Philip Glass composed the music for the film. So the film continues to be screened somewhere in the world every single day. It's amazing. It has received numerous awards, was broadcast on PBS. And many honors, including 2 Emmy nominations for Best Director and Best Documentary. So it's just such a pleasure to have you here, Mickey. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for Skyping with me.
Yeah, this is great. First of all, congratulations on the movie. It was really so beautifully done, and it's it's an amazing story, and it needs to be told. I know you started telling it in 1992. Tell folks about why you decided to make this movie now.
Well, it's a great story and a great subject, and as you said in the introduction, in 1992, I made the first major movie that was made about him. Nobody had done it before then. And, he wasn't the world rock star that he is today. And very few people knew about what was going on inside Tibet with the occupation by the People's Republic of China. And after I finish a film, I think, okay, I've made the definitive statement about whatever it is, and now I can, go on to something else. But a lot's changed in the 25 years since we made the movie, and changed for him, changed for me. And I've been blessed with the opportunity to meet him pretty much every year. I serve as the chairman of the board of the Tibet Fund, which is his foundation for cultural preservation and humanitarian efforts with the Tibetan people. And so I see him pretty much every year. And, he's changed. Things have changed in those 25 years. And I thought, well, maybe it's time to do another one. And, I talked to him about it, and he said, okay, let's do it. And here we are. The other thing is that I'm in the generation of baby boomers. And as a friend of mine says, they're starting to shoot at our regiment now. I'm losing friends, and people are dealing with serious illnesses and so forth. And I'm dealing with aging and dying, along with the rest of my generation. And so I figured, well, why not ask the world's most conscious person how he's dealing with it? He was just about to turn 80 when we did most of the filming, because I figured maybe he could help all of us.
And you did such a beautiful job. For those of you who have not seen it, which is probably most of you, because it's just really starting to be rolling out now in select cities. But I do hope that you will see it, because it is amazing. And what I love about it, Mickey, is you do ask him very point blank questions about life and, you know, handling life. And it's not extremely esoteric. It's really about, you know, how do you be a human being in this world and, you know, negotiate the pains and the trials of life. And it's just, you know, his answers are just beautiful. And you've made it very clear that he's a man, you know, he's a human being living, you know, amongst us. He's a spiritual being, you know, having a human experience, but there's a lot of talk about that human experience and what that's like. And it just makes it so accessible for the rest of us humans, you know?
Well, you know, the best description I ever heard of His Holiness was from Sir Hugh Richardson, who was the British envoy who was in Lhasa in 1935 and 37 when they brought the newly discovered Dalai Lama, this 2.5-year-old boy, into Lhasa as the reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama. And so he knew His Holiness through the rest of his life. And his description was that His Holiness is the most saintly of humans and the most human of saints. And that's part of the reason that I love the man is after I did the first movie about the Dalai Lama in 92, as you said, I got calls from all of these swamis and gurus and their people, their handlers, asking me if I would make a movie about their guru or their swami. And I would say to them, you know, it's not a spigot that I can turn on and off. It's like I've got to see how I feel about the person in my heart. And if I got the slightest inkling that the person was promoting their divinity and denying their humanity, I was out of there. Because, you know, that's really dangerous. And there's one very, very world famous Swami who wanted me to do a movie about him. And his handler asked me to write out the questions the day before I was to interview him. And so I wrote out 7 pages of questions. And when she was reading through them before we did the interview, she came to the penultimate question and she went, "Oh, no, no one can ask this of Baba." And the question was, "Baba, who around you can tell you when you've made a mistake?"
Wow.
And there was something that had been troubling me about this ashram that I was in, and I couldn't put my finger on it until that moment, and then I knew. Because if you have a human being that's supposed to be infallible, you've got a big problem.
Amen.
And because their shadow side, it's going to manifest itself somewhere, and if you're in denial about it, you've got a serious problem.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of these so-called gurus and teachers get into trouble, is that they're in denial about their own humanity. And His Holiness totally embraced it. When I went to interview him for the first movie in 1990, I had an audience with him for an hour, and I had to test out the kinds of questions that I would be asking him when I interviewed him for the movie. So I had to ask him like personal questions, political questions, religious questions, philosophical questions, and just hear how he answered them and hear whether or not they were usable in a documentary film, because not everything is. Some things that go on for, you know, maybe a 5 or 6 minute explanation about something you just actually can't use, because, you know, it won't hold. So I was trying these out, and then the last question was, "Your Holiness, who around you can tell you when you've made a mistake?" Because if he said nobody, I wasn't sure I could make the movie. So when I asked him that, he said, "Everybody." He said, "How else am I going to learn?"
Oh, that's beautiful. And that really does sum him up, because you've done such a beautiful job in really helping people see the man and the spiritual being, you know, and he's so accessible and so fallible, as he's the first to admit. And it's just, gosh, it was so refreshing to really witness that. You've got some amazing stories, but I want first, for those who really don't know the Dalai Lama's evolution as the Dalai Lama, and now his time in exile. Could you just briefly talk about that?
You mean the arc of his life?
Yes, exactly.
In 2.5 minutes?
Yep, just kind of just rattle it off.
Okay. Well, His Holiness was born in a cow barn to uneducated peasant parents in an obscure corner of northeastern Tibet. And when he was about 2.5, a search party arrived and discovered him to be the reincarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama. Through a series of tests, they laid out on a table a walking stick, a ritual drum, some prayer beads, and some other objects that had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama, and next to an identical copy or a fancier copy that would appeal to a 2.5-year-old. And the child surveyed the table, picked out each of the items that had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama, went in the corner and said, "These are mine. I'm not giving them back." And so he then was brought to Lhasa, to the capital, and he lived up in this. I think a lot of your viewers have probably seen the Potala Palace, this giant palace that was built by the 5th Dalai Lama, and it's 1,000 rooms, and that was his home. And he was separated from his family. His family was brought to Lhasa as well. They had a special house, but they could only visit him like a couple of times a month.
Wow.
And he was then brought up primarily by 2 main tutors who led him through like a 23-year course of studies, which included, all these subjects, history, music, art, literature, astronomy, all kinds of mathematics, things like that. But part of his training was every day for several hours, he would meditate on compassion. And one of the things, His Holiness is now engaged with some of the world's cutting edge neuroscientists. He started this about 25 years ago, and I'll circle around back to that. But one of the things the neuroscientists are now interested in is what is the effect of a human brain that, while it's in formation, is meditating on compassion every day. And as some of your viewers might know, the brain is formulating from conception until about 21 or 22, when the frontal cortex is finally set. And so they're fascinated by what is the effect of this. And one of the things is these Tibetan monks who were discovered early to be these reincarnations, but also part of any monk's training is the meditation on compassion. And so what they're finding is when they put these people into MRI machines, and they'll show them photographs of the human condition, of puppies and picnics in the park and boating on the Thames and happy days. And then all of a sudden they'll put in a picture of some human atrocity, some war picture or something. And the part of the brain that deals with compassion just lights up in these beings. And it takes up a big portion of the brain. Now, I'm making this assumption but most of us, it might be the size of maybe a golf ball. And if you're a sociopath, it doesn't light up at all. And so, what these neuroscientists have found is that it's not something you're born with, and it's not fixed for your life. That it's possible to increase your capacity for compassion, just like it's possible to increase your capacity for happiness in this life. That it's not something that's fixed. That you can actually work on it like a skill, like your tennis serve, and increase your capacity for happiness in this life.
Yeah, I completely concur with that. I mean, being in the field of helping people with emotional eating and with my husband together helping people with addictions for 30 years, it's really been, the number one way that people can turn their life around is reframing, situations in their life where they feel victimized. And so they don't carry that resentment, so they don't carry that hurt. And really the best way you can reframe something is to see it from their perspective, to really identify sort of what might be going on for somebody who causes harm, because, hurt people. And the more you can relate and see sort of what might be going through their brain, or what their history of abuse is, or all the number of factors, it can change your own concept of what happened, so that all of a sudden, you have that opening of your heart, and that resource of compassion well up in you that can just completely change the resentment and turn it to love. And it's so much of what that movie is about.
Yes, exactly. I mean, one of the major themes in the movie is the work that His Holiness has been doing with these neuroscientists. And 25 years ago, he met with a group of them, and he challenged them. He said, we Tibetans have been holding the technology for how to overcome negative afflictive emotions, such as anger, greed, jealousy, hatred, violence, ignorance. He said, we've been holding the technology for how to overcome these for 1,000 years. And now it's time to share it with all of humanity. But he said the problem is that if it came from one specific religious tradition, the others wouldn't buy it. So he challenged scientists, and he said, explore this. He didn't say prove it. He said explore it. And if you find value in it, spread it as widely as possible. And I don't think it's either a coincidence or an accident that 25 years ago, this whole mindfulness movement started spreading across the nation and the world. And I see that it was exactly when His Holiness challenged these scientists to study mindfulness. And a friend of mine told me that you can now get mindfulness mayonnaise in Whole Foods. It's spread that far, and no pun intended. So to sort of paraphrase this complex process, we all believe that the voice that we hear inside of our head is telling us the truth. We all of us do. But it's not really the truth. It's just a construct of our minds organizing our reality for us. And it's not reality. It's our personal subjective reality. And science has shown, and I don't know how they've proven this, but that 90% of the thoughts that you're going to have today, you had yesterday, and you had the day before. That we just keep rethinking the same thoughts over and over and over again. And that then becomes our reality. And the best way to deal with that is to learn how to meditate. Because in meditation, that's part of what the benefit of the practice is that you observe how thoughts rise in your mind. And what usually happens when a thought arises in your mind, gee, if I was just in a relationship, I'd be happy. That's a thought that some people listening might have over and over and over again. But if they're not in a relationship, the gap between their reality and what they want it to be is suffering. It's suffering. If you want to be someplace that you're not, then you're suffering. Or if you're in a relationship and you say to yourself, if only I was not in this relationship, I'd be happy. Then again, there's this gap. So when I have friends actually that say to me, God, I wish I was in a relationship, or if they're not, and if they are, and they say, God, I wish I wasn't in this relationship, I always counsel them. I say, the grass is brown on both sides of the fence.
It's so not
true. There's no magic about being in a relationship or not in a relationship. The problem is if you want to be in the place that you're not, because in that gap is you're going to suffer.
Yeah.
So in this, as you observe your thoughts rising, then you just see them. You don't hold on to them. You don't engage them. You don't think about them. You don't do what you normally do. You just watch it rise, and then you let it go like a cloud on a windy day. And then you come back to thinking about your breath, and then another thought rises. You observe it and let it go. And over time, the reason it's called a practice is you can't just do it once and have it work. But if you do this over time, you start to see how your mind is creating this suffering of your reality, this pain, and see that you don't that it's not necessarily your reality. It's just your mind. Yeah. And you also start to identify with the witness to the thoughts and not the thoughts themselves.
Yeah.
And that's the technology for inner peace.
Absolutely. It's so beautiful.
And actually the Dalai Lama said this is actually the technology for world peace.
That's so true, because then we're not attached to our emotions. We're not on an emotional roller coaster ride. We're actually just observers.
Right, and you can then actually see reality clearly and not clouded by your own fear and desire.
Right. Yeah.
And when you see reality clearly, you can make much better choices.
Yeah, it's so true, and such a good lesson for my audience here. In terms of really learning that we are not our emotions. We don't need to react to everything we feel. We can actually respond to life instead of react. In unhealthy habits. So that's just beautiful. I want to finish the arc that we were talking about for those who don't know about the Dalai Lama and his, being in exile and how that came about. And, obviously.
I got up to age 3. He just turned 82, so there's a little bit of filling in I need to do. So he grew up in this 1,000-room palace. He was trained by 2 of the great minds in Tibet at the time. And when he was a teenager, Tibet was invaded by the newly formed People's Republic of China in 1949-50. They started invading Tibet. And they wanted the resources, and they wanted to control the high ground of Asia, and they wanted to control the source of the rivers, all of the 4 major river systems in Asia. And so they claimed that they were liberating Tibet from imperialist forces, but I think there were 3 Westerners living in all of Tibet at the time, so it was a little suspect. And Tibet was thrown into turmoil, and the people turned and they asked the 16-year-old Dalai Lama if he would take over control of the state. Usually they waited till after he was in his 20s, but because of this. So he did, and one of the first things he did was to go to China to meet with Mao and Zhou Enlai to negotiate for his country. And he had just turned 19. So he met with Mao. Mao basically acted very paternal and sweet, and the Dalai Lama was taken by him. He was very charming, and Mao made all these promises to him, which were all a lie. He said, we won't change any of the institutions of Tibet. We'll leave the religious institutions, the political institutions. We won't take anything. And meanwhile, they destroyed 90%, 6,000 monasteries and shrines, and killed 1.3 million people, most of them to nuns and monks, and the Rinpoches, these holders of this wisdom, and basically devastated the country. And they've now moved more Chinese into Tibet than there are Tibetans. So Tibetans are now a minority in their own country. And they're systematically destroying the culture. Wow. And anybody who would object to it would be put into a prison or a concentration camp for maybe 20 years if they said that Tibet was an independent country. That would be the crime, to claim that Tibet was actually independent. They'd be put into a concentration camp for 20 years if they managed to live. It was a miracle. I spoke to his personal physician, who spent 17 years in a Chinese gulag, and he said, 4,000 or 5,000 of us went in, and 300 came out.
Wow.
17 years later. So, for 3 times the UN called it genocide, until China became a permanent member of the UN, and then they stopped doing that. And so in 1959, it became clear that the Chinese were probably plotting to kill the young Dalai Lama. And one night, he and a few members of his family and people very, very close to him escaped on horseback. It took 17 days, and they made it to India. And he went into exile. And he was met by Nehru's representative who welcomed them into India. And he's been there ever since. He hasn't been back to Tibet. He hasn't seen his homeland since he was in his early 20s.
Wow.
So he's been in India. They're about 150 miles northwest of Delhi in the foothills of the Himalayas. There's a small former British hill station called McLeodganj, or in Dharamsala, a town called Dharamsala. And His Holiness has been there trying to take care of his people, the people in exile. You know, the first thing the Indian government had them do was build roads, breaking up bigger rocks into smaller rocks. And so His Holiness said, this won't do. So he set up an education system for the children and, you know, hospitals and so forth. And so now it's a thriving community in exile. About 150,000 Tibetans live in exile. They maintain their Tibetan identity. Most of them have not become Indian citizens. You know, if you ask them, they say, oh, I'm a Tibetan. His Holiness established a government in exile, a democratic government in exile, and then a few years ago stepped down for being traditionally the Dalai Lama, after the fifth Dalai Lama, who consolidated Tibet. The Dalai Lama was both the spiritual leader but also the political leader of Tibet. And this Dalai Lama, the 14th, a few years ago stepped down from being the political head and gave the political power to an elected representative government. And there's like a prime minister and a cabinet and a parliament. And, you know, there are very, very few, I think a handful of examples in all of history of people giving up political power.
Right.
I mean, I think that's why we all love and revere George Washington so much, because after 2 terms he said, you know, that's it. And I think there's a Roman emperor who did it, but there are very few examples in all of history.
Yeah.
So anyway, so he did that. He did that recently, but before that, in 1989, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And the reason why is that with all of the Chinese invasion and all of the atrocities, he has never once advocated any form of violence. His response to the Chinese was, it's always nonviolent. And he says, look, we're always going to be neighbors. No matter what the final solution is, we're still going to be neighbors. And we can't like lift Tibet up and move it, you know, to the south of France. You know, and so we need to get along. And so every statement he makes and everything he's done has been with that in mind, that it needs to be a peaceful solution to whatever the problem is. But sadly, the Chinese have, I think there's an expression, stone-faced black heart or something like that, where they refuse to negotiate any kind of settlement.
It's so sad. It's such a tragedy and such a, you know, I mean, for our whole world to lose the richness of that culture, you know, in Tibet on account of the Chinese is just so sad. But so much of the movie is about forgiveness and, you know, really holding on to love in spite of, you know, the temptation to hate. And if anybody had, you know, a quote justification to hate, it would be the Dalai Lama for the Chinese. But obviously that's not who he is, and that's not what he teaches. And he, you know, he is a living, breathing example, as Nelson Mandela had been, you know, for loving in the face of all systems go on holding hate in your heart.
Well, you know, I mean, I personally believe that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Nelson Mandela started with Desmond Tutu changed the DNA of the species. You know, this was a time when people came to power. And I mean, I remember as a kid when, you know, they said, well, you know, if the white people ever gave up control in South Africa, there'd be a bloodbath. and there wasn't. And and I think that the Marshall Plan was also in that same ilk, not to vanquish your enemy, because we saw the effect after World War I, of what happened when you really vanquish your enemy and rub their noses in their defeat, and it gave rise to Hitler.
Right.
I heard that there were two people at the Treaty of Versailles. I did this movie about a man named Sir Lawrence Vanderpost, a wonderful South African philosopher, commando leader. And when he was about to leave South Africa and go to England, he met the head of South Africa was a man named Smuts. And he met him, and Smuts said, well, when you go to England, look up, there's a really bright economist he said, I was just at the Treaty of Versailles, and there was one bright young British economist, and he and I were the only people that saw what the effect of the Treaty of Versailles was going to be. And he said, when you get to England, look him up. He's a member of the Bloomsbury Group. And it was John Maynard Keynes. And so, but some conscious people did see what the outcome was going to be. And like you said earlier, I think the Tibetan culture is a spiritual equivalent of the rainforest. It really belongs to the world. And just like the rainforest doesn't really belong to Brazil or the other countries along the Amazon there, it's a world resource. And it's being destroyed. It's being cut down so that they can have pastures to raise cows for McDonald's burgers,
Right.
And it's changing the weather patterns of the planet. And just like that, the Tibetan culture that's held this knowledge, spiritual knowledge, for 1,000 years is being destroyed just as quickly as the rainforest. And it belongs to all of us.
Yeah.
It's to a benefit to all of us.
Yeah. Well, it's so, it just speaking with you just makes me so grateful for these two movies that you have made, because the story must, be told, and the legacy must live on, and we must learn, from these spiritual teachers so that we can, aspire to be, to live our best selves, and to, vanquish hate from our heart, and to really just live as the Dalai Lama has lived. And I just think he is such a beautiful example of these principles. They're spiritual principles that we can find in every religion. They transcend religion. These ideas of compassion and forgiveness and love, and it's just something we can learn from and just take into our daily lives, because that's my own. We all have that struggle. The struggle with our thoughts, the struggle with what's in our heart. And really, every day trying to live a better version of ourselves so that we don't either hurt ourselves or hurt somebody else, and I was filled with so much compassion and love just watching this man, and then, a couple days, it's been a few days since I saw the movie, but just having that reminder, in just of the Dalai Lama and how much that helps me and is a source of inspiration for me. So I just thank you for bringing this to the world, so that we can use it in our everyday lives and use it as a North Star for us on how to live.
Well, he's the best example I know. And again, I go back to the fact that he's the most human of saints. It's not, for people maybe watching this, they'll think, well, of course he's the Dalai Lama, it's his job, but it's really accessible to all of us. We can all use this, and there's a moment in the movie that I shot back in the early 90s in Compassion in Exile, and it's in the movie, where I ask him, I say, do you hate the Chinese? And he says, no. He said, no hatred feeling. He said, sometimes I lose patience with them, but no hatred feeling. He said, in fact, every day part of my daily practice is something called exchange, or take and give. He says, I take their anger, their ignorance, their hatred into myself, in my imagination, and return to them love and compassion. And That was one of the reasons that I made the first movie. Was I had heard him. Somebody had asked him if he hated the Chinese, and he said no. And I thought, well, I want to learn how to do that, because if he doesn't hate the Chinese, then maybe I can learn not to hate some of the people in my family, you know. And
right.
And so for me, making a movie always starts with a question. It's like, I want to learn more about something. And but I also had the wonderful opportunity to ask him a follow-up question 25 years later. So in the movie, I show that clip in the new movie, The Last Dalai Lama, ? I show that clip, and then right following that is him today, and I say, Your Holiness, 25 years ago, I asked you if you hated the Chinese, and you said no. And then you explain your daily practice of exchange, of taking on their anger and ignorance and hatred, and returning to them love and compassion. I said, has that done any good? I said, what's who's benefited by your 40 years of doing this practice every day? And he didn't miss a beat. He just said, oh, the benefit's for myself.
Yep.
He said, it's not going to solve the problem, but it helps me to keep my mind calm. And so, he thinks if you have a calm mind, you're going to make much better decisions than if it's filled with anger, hatred, jealousy, greed, desire. So that's why he does it.
Yeah, that's the truth. That was so beautiful. It's something we teach all the time, is that, we do these practices. We meditate for us, not because we're so holy, or so good. I meditate because it brings me a sense of calm and peace that helps me negotiate the stresses of life better. It helps me not have to overeat. It helps me, I pray not because God needs me to pray, but because it makes me feel more peaceful, and I'm a friendlier person, and things happen because I'm more connected. I'm just in that flow, that conscious flow, and I don't have to work so hard. Things just come in the flow naturally and easily and in divine order. And so it's always for us, and and the benefits are enormous.
Well, I've been meditating for 30 years, and I do it every morning for 20 minutes, and I don't think I'd be ambulatory if I didn't do it.
Right.
It's
so true. Once in a very blue moon, I'll have to run out and do something before I meditate. I rarely, it's like once a year or something, but I have to, I've been too late. I slept through my alarm or something, and so I'll have to dart out the door, and I literally have to pray to drive safely, because my head is not right if I haven't meditated. I don't trust myself on the road.
I always feel like the few times that it's happened to me, I feel like you go out and it's like, oh, I forgot to brush my teeth today. Something's a little off.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yep.
The great thing is I can meditate on the subway going to work or whatever.
Exactly. It is such a beautiful thing. It's just the treasures of meditation are just too many to even mention. It's just incredible. So I just think it's such an important message, especially about the compassion, how you can cultivate compassion through meditation. I just absolutely love that. Any other stories? Sorry.
And I'll also say, some people kind of have a fear of it. They think that it makes you passive, and that people will take advantage of you if you meditate. But in fact, the opposite is true. It makes your mind much sharper, and you are much better at, if you're in a negotiation, you think much more clearly. If you're in a sporting event, I can see the Olympic athletes that don't meditate and let the pressure of the event build up on them, and they do subpar performances because they don't meditate.
Absolutely.
It's a phenomenal tool, and it's the essence of, for those of you who have read the Bhagavad Gita, which is the key book in Hinduism, it's in the heart of the book. Krishna, or God, tells it to this general who doesn't want to start a war because he said, I'll cause the death of so many people. And Krishna says, look, just do your job, do it impeccably, but don't be attached to the outcome. And that's such a great life lesson. It doesn't mean you become passive and that people are going to walk all over you. It means that you're going to be able to fight for what your position is much, much better.
Yep.
And especially if you're not attached to the outcome. If you're constantly thinking about the way you want it to end, then sometimes you get in your own way.
Yep.
But if you just fight for what you think is important, but you're not focusing on what the outcome looks like, then you might get the outcome. It'll just look differently.
Yep.
But you'll recognize it. You'll recognize it because you're not attached to the picture that you have in your mind of how it's supposed to be.
That's so true. It's funny you said that about sports too, because the woman who taught me to meditate, actually here in Beverly Hills, TM, she's a TM teacher, and she actually she teaches a lot of people in Beverly Hills, and one of the people she taught many, like decades ago was John McEnroe, and she, we all know how John McEnroe used to be on the tennis court.
Did she do anger management with him?
Well, it seemed to have that effect, because she said after he learned and started practicing TM, he didn't have those angry outbursts, and it helped him literally control his emotional state. And I think that's just such a brilliant example of how meditation can help one.
Yeah. And it doesn't make you a patsy or passive, or it makes you much clearer and stronger. Yep.
I'm sure he won more games after, with a whole lot less stress and penalties on account of meditating first. So, well, that's just awesome. And then you have another movie that you've made in the past about Ram Dass as well. I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, it's called Ram Dass Fierce Grace. And I had known Ram Dass since the early 70s, and he's a great teacher, one of my greatest teachers. And after I finished the first movie about His Holiness in 1992, I showed it at a big international conference in Prague, and Ram Dass was one of the speakers. He sat right in the front row. He came up to me after, and he said, "I loved your movie. I want you to bring it to my next retreat. I want you to show it, talk about it." I said, "Okay, but you're next." And he said, No, I'm not ready. So then a few years later, I did this movie about Sir Lawrence Vanderpost. And as it happened, I was at another conference, this time in Brazil, and Ram Dass was one of the speakers, and he watched the movie, and he came up after. He said, I love the movie. I want a copy of it. I need to send it to these people. I want you to bring it to my next retreat and show it and talk about it. I said, "Okay, but you're next." He said, No, I'm not ready. And then, and for that was like about 8 years, I'd been carrying this movie around in my head. I knew him then for 20 years, and I'd gone to his workshops and lectures. I'd read all his books. I knew all of his stories. I could tell them. I could tell all of his stories. I knew, I knew them, and I knew his history, and I knew how I wanted to structure the movie, what the sort of the clothesline was going to be, and then what stories I wanted to hang off of the clothesline, and how I would structure it. And for a filmmaker, the key to make your movie is what's the structure of the storytelling. Most people just see the surface of the movie and are carried along by the story, but that's because the structure works. And if you're not, then there's something wrong with the structure. So, like, my brother's an architect, and if he walks into a room, like if I walk into a room, I notice maybe the color of the walls and the furniture in it and so forth. He looks inside the walls and sees where the pipes are to go to the bathroom in the second floor, and all the electrical fixtures, and how this particular beam is being suspended. And anyway, so for a filmmaker, it's really all about story structure. So how do you give the audience information here, here, and here, so that when you get to this moment, the audience will laugh or cry? And so but I knew how I was going to structure the movie. All I had to do was shoot it, right? And then he had a stroke. He had this massive stroke for 2 months. It was really touch and go. People thought he was going to die. He had this one very sensitive doctor who said to a mutual friend, he couldn't swallow, he couldn't speak, he was paralyzed on his right side. And the doctor said, he's never going to make any improvement. He's either going to be a vegetable or he's going to die. And, little by little by little, he's made this progress to where he, a couple of times a year he has these workshops. In the winter, 300 people come. He has podcasts every week. He has, Skypes with people. He's written, I think, three or four books since his stroke. So about 2 months right after he got out of the hospital with the stroke, I went to visit him. He was living in Marin at the time. And we were just hanging out on his porch, not talking a lot because he couldn't really, but just hanging out and chatting a little. And then at the end of the afternoon, I said, R.D., maybe it's time we made this movie. And he said, okay. And so when I got back so this was after 8 years of trying to convince him to do it, right? And so when I got back to New York, I wrote him a letter and said, I think this is what we agreed to. I didn't want to be accused of taking advantage of him. And so I said, I think this is what we agreed to. Is that right? And he wrote back and said, yeah, let's do it. And so one of the things he said to me that day was he pointed to himself with his left hand, which still worked. His right hand was what didn't work at all. He said, this isn't who I thought I was going to be, because my vision of myself old didn't have a stroke in it. So if I think about who I was supposed to be, or I think about who I used to be, I just suffer. He said, if I just rest in awareness, I'm in bliss. And I'm actually visiting him right now. I mean, this is his house.
Wow.
And
wow.
As it turns out. And I said to him last night, my uncle had the exact same stroke. He was paralyzed on his right side, had speech aphasia. And he woke up, he had flown B-29s during the war. He was super macho. He could do chin-ups on the door jamb. He skied half the year. He was a life-embracing sybarite. He loved great food and wine and women, and he was full of life. And then he had this stroke, and he woke up in hell every morning because he thought, this is not who I was supposed to be. There's been an error in the system. God must have been asleep. And so he just got more and more depressed. And after about 3 years, he just stopped. And I believe that the average life expectancy for somebody with that kind of stroke, being paralyzed on half your body, speech aphasia, and so forth, it's about 3 to 5 years. Ram Dass is not past 20 years. I think I told him last night, I said, I think this is a world record. I said we should call, this must be a world record. And the reason why is in the 20 years since he had the stroke, I've never heard him once say anything that was self-pitying. He's never once, yelled, raised his fist against the universe. It's just like, oh, whole new life,
Yeah.
And he just rests in awareness, and he's loving and smart and not bitter, because he wasn't attached to how he thought it was supposed to be.
That is such a good lesson for all of us. I'm telling you, it's just beautiful. And I think, it just proves the point that, who was it, Lincoln, that said we're as happy as we make up our minds to be, and it's just, it's a hard thing. It's easier said than done, but it is our mental state that creates our reality.
Well, again, the thing about meditation is that there's sometimes when I'll sit down to meditate and my mind will be racing, and I'll say to myself, okay, for the next 20 minutes, the world doesn't need fixing. It doesn't need my opinion about it. It doesn't need my thoughts about how to make it a better place. I am just going to accept that everything is perfect just as it is for 20 minutes, and just accept that everything is perfect just the way it is, and just rest in awareness that it's perfect. And it's like I have this one meditation teacher who would start meditation by saying, rest your weary mind. So if you allow yourself to do it for just 20 minutes, and then at the end of it, you can kind of see more clearly.
Yeah.
And then you see the noise that is coming, you're creating it.
Yeah.
The world is,
It's beautiful, and it's so true. And just, gosh, 20 minutes. It's not a lot. We'll give 20 minutes to all kinds of nonsense. So 20 minutes to ourselves and to our happiness is not a lot to ask.
No, and it sets you up for the whole day.
Yep. That's beautiful. Well, Mickey, this has been such a pleasure. I am so grateful that you are here and agreed to spend this time together and talk about your amazing film, and your amazing life. I mean, what a beautiful life you've lived to really commit yourself and your work to raising the consciousness of the world and bringing, shining the spotlight on people who are doing that in their lives and for other people. So I thank you for your service to all of us and bringing these wonderful stories, to film and, in your own quest. And it's just really been a pleasure. And I just want to encourage everybody to see, wherever you have to go, however long, far you have to drive to see The Last Dalai Lama. It is just a gem of a movie, and it will just lift your spirits, and you'll take it with you in your heart for many days, if not weeks and months to come. So I really encourage you to check it out, and tell us a little bit about where they can see it and how that's going to roll out. Obviously, the more we all talk about it, the more we promote it on social media, and I'm going to be doing a lot of that. The more, funding you'll have and channels you'll have to show this film, right?
Right. Thank you for that. There's a website, the Last Dalai Lama Film.com. And if you go there, on there's a list of all the places that it's now currently playing and all the places where it's scheduled to play. And then at the bottom, there's a request form where if you wanted to come to your city or your town, you just fill it out and it goes to the distributor and they try to make that happen. So
we'll put that link, we'll put that in the show notes so they can click on that also.
Okay, yeah. Great. So just click on the link and then you'll know when it's going to be in your area or give you the opportunity to request it.
Yeah.
And then in a few months' time, after it's had its theatrical run, it'll be available to stream or to download, or to DVDs will be available. But that has to wait till after it runs in theaters.
Okay, so we can all play a part, talking about this universal consciousness, and we're all part of this whole. We can play an important part in the distribution of this important film. So thank you, everybody, for your support in that. And thank you, Mickey. It's just been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It has been. Thank you.
God bless.
If you enjoyed this show and want to get free support, insider health info, exclusive invites to events, and more, visit healyourhunger.com.